Hello, friends. We are going to start our studies of world religions by doing an introduction to some key terms that we need to understand before we move forward, as well as to look at some of the earliest categories of faith systems called animism. Before we learn some of these terms, I want to begin by offering a look at a speech given by this person shown here named Swami Vivekananda. So, this was a really big moment in the late 1800s. So, on September 11th, 1893, there was a really interesting meeting of individuals from all around the world from various faiths in Chicago called the World Congress of Religions. And Swami Vivekananda was invited to be the keynote speaker at this conference because this was a moment when Hinduism began to pique the interests of Westerners. And I should say that this World Congress of Religions was organized because there was a consciousness raising amongst Westerners, especially, wondering whether or not European and Western imperialism, or taking over other parts of the world, was creating damage, had negative effects, and they were really worried about a lot of political but also cultural conflict emerging around the world. So they were hoping to create a space to create more cultural understanding. It was a really beautiful moment. So Swami Vivekananda, as I said, was invited to give the keynote speech. And I'm sure that the record has been broken, but for a while, this speech was credited with receiving the longest standing ovation recorded. And apparently, the speech was pretty short, only a few minutes long, but people stood applauding for a long time. I forget the exact number of minutes or whatever like that, but he was like really beloved. And I'd like to start our look at world religions with this quote for a couple reasons. One, it shows us the true philosophy behind what we know as Hinduism in terms of being a really inclusive faith. And I also want to kind of pose the question at some point in the year about the function of religions and the interconnectedness of religions, which I think his speech speaks to. So I'll read it. You can follow along, and we'll chat about it when we're together. So part of his speech says, "Sisters and brothers of America, it fills my heart with joy unspeakable to rise in response to the warm and cordial welcome which you have given us. I thank you in the name of the most ancient order of monks in the world. I thank you in the name of the Mother of Religions. And I thank you in the name of millions and millions of Hindu people of all classes and sects. I am proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true. I am proud to belong to a nation which has sheltered the persecuted and the refugees of all religions and all nations of the earth. The present convention, which is one of the most august assemblies ever held, is in itself a vindication, a declaration to the world of the wonderful doctrine preached in the Gita," which he's referring to the Bhagavad Gita, a holy hymn within Hinduism. And this is the quote. "As different streams having their sources in different places all mingle their water in the sea, so, O Lord, the different paths which men take through different tendencies, various though they appear, crooked or straight, all lead to thee. Whosoever comes to me, through whatsoever form, I reach him. All men are struggling through paths which in the end lead to me." So we'll chat together as a class about this quote. We'll also have to reckon with the fact that there are Hindu leaders that don't show the level of tolerance that's indicated in this quote. But I do kind of want to pose it out there about the idea of religion all being a vehicle that might look different, but ultimately is searching to do a very similar thing for all people, which is to connect to the divine, to connect to the mysteries of the world. But those paths might be very different. So we'll chat about that quote. I just think it's really cool, and I wanted to bring it to your attention. So let's start to get into some terminology that's very important for us. First, we will categorize the faiths that we study into two major categories: tribal and universal. The earliest faiths on earth are the tribal faiths. Many of them still continue on today. Many have been lost throughout the ages. But the characters or characteristics of tribal faiths include that they are usually tied to a specific ethnic group or to a specific region of the world, thus the term tribal. So tribal faiths usually are smaller scale. Some have grown in size. And what's really important about the concept of tribal faiths and how they are transmitted is that usually tribal faiths do not seek to convert. They don't usually have missionary traditions. The way that you are a member of a tribal faith is that you're born into it. And so as a result, tribal faiths are usually much older and do usually have some sort of ethnic or linguistic connection to a kind of territory or whatnot. So some of our examples of tribal faiths include Hinduism. And even though Hinduism is a huge religion, that has more to do with the fact that India has become a very populated place, and that is the point of origin for Hinduism. Otherwise, what we will learn, or maybe you already know, is that Hinduism doesn't seek to convert people. There was a movement in the 20th century called the Hare Krishna we'll talk about that had some of that, but that is an aberration, right? That's not the norm. You don't see people of the Hindu tradition like knocking on people's doors and asking them, have you accepted Vishnu into your heart? You just don't really see that. You're born into the faith, and that's how you become Hindu. Another example is Judaism, right? Judaism is connected to the Hebrew people, right, which was an ethno-linguistic group and is today, obviously. You were born into Judaism, and we'll talk about how the origins of the faith were connected to the Hebrew tribes. Obviously, you can convert to these faiths, and I'm sure you know people who converted to Judaism. So it's not like you're not allowed to join these faiths. There's just not an effort to convert people to those faiths. So those are two of our examples of tribal faiths. Universal faiths are faiths that usually do have a missionary tradition, right? People who go out and try to convert. And these universal faiths usually start from a tribal faith. That there is a person who was born into the tribal faith who either has like some sort of religious epiphany, some sort of religious awakening, or maybe a disagreement with the original faith. So they break off from that faith. They usually keep some of the traditions of that tribal faith, but then build on them and add new holy books or beliefs or traditions, and then seek to spread that faith to whomever they, whoever they reach. Universal faiths tend to believe that their faith is like one of the only ways to achieve salvation. Tend to, again, these are broad generalizations. And yeah, they usually have more of a wider footprint on the world. So our examples will include Buddhism. So we'll learn that Buddhism grew out of Hinduism, that Siddhartha Gautama, known as the Buddha, was a Hindu who has a breaking away from Hindu tradition. And we'll see that Buddhism has a lot in common with Hinduism because of its shared origins. The universal faiths of Christianity and Islam both come from the Jewish tradition. We'll learn that Christianity grew from Jewish tradition because Jesus of Nazareth was Jewish. And so the early Christian tradition was building off of Jewish tradition. Islam also comes out of the Jewish and Christian tradition, and we'll see that there is some like ethnic and historical lineage that connects Muhammad to Abraham. But more importantly, Muhammad, the founder of Islam, really respected Christianity and Judaism and their God that they worshipped. And so he embraced that as well as some of their prophets. And we will see a lot of continuities between Jewish and Christian faith and Islamic faith. So these are some terms that we need to know. A couple other terms I want to talk about are the differences between monotheism, monism, and polytheism, because these are separate ideas, and understanding them is going to help us understand the complexities of the faiths that we study. So, monotheism is a belief that there is one deity who was in control of creation. And usually people are very aware of this. Judaism, Islam, Christianity are all classic monotheistic faiths, and we have to remember that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all believe in the same God, even if they use different languages and words to describe that God or name that God. Now, monism is a little different. Okay, so monism, we're going to see multiple faiths, including Hinduism, that are technically monistic faiths. So monism is, as I say here, the view that reality is a unified whole and that all existing things can be ascribed to or described by a single concept or system. All life forces proceed from the same essence and thus they are connected. So in Hinduism, that essence that connects all is the concept of Shakti, which I'll talk about more in the context of Hinduism. So monism and monotheism, the way that they are different is this. Monotheism usually believes in a God entity, that there's a deity, right? Kind of a singular being that is in charge of creation. The way I understand monism is that it's more about energy, that there is this, like Shakti, for example, so a primordial energy that pre-existed everything that we see as living. And that includes the gods or God, right? Whatever religion we're talking about. And that all existence proceeded from that life force. So that means that everything from the gods or God, earth, human beings, animals, etc., are all actually forged out of the same entity. So faiths that embrace a monistic worldview have a huge emphasis on things like karma, and I'll define that more for those who aren't familiar later. There's a lot more kind of connectivity in those religions, right? In monism, God isn't some other being that is above us and who dictates all, right? Instead, in monism, there is all this kind of connected energy. And then lastly, we have polytheism. So polytheism, I want us to think more about like the Greek gods. That's a really classic version of polytheism. These many gods who exist in their own right and who all have their own different jobs. So there's kind of a misunderstanding about Hinduism because on the surface it looks really polytheistic, right? But when we get to it, we'll see that all these gods have proceeded from one energetic force. So it's technically more monistic than polytheistic. So we're going to also talk about in this video the concept of animism. So we do not have time to go over all the different types of animist faiths because there are just so many of them. But the earliest religions that we understand to have existed throughout the world are animist religions. So animism is a heading. It's a category of faiths. And as it says here, animism is a religious belief that objects, places, and creatures all possess spiritual essences. So it's the idea that all beings, including, as it says here, animals, plants, rocks, rivers, weather systems, right? So the wind and the rain. Also human handiwork. So for example, totem poles or maybe ceremonial masks. And even words themselves can have power, that they're animated and that they're alive. And so animism as a heading is generally usually a belief system that honors nature, and the interplay between the living world that you can see and the spiritual world that's all around us that you may not be able to see. And then last bullet point, in most cases, animism is not considered to be a religion in its own right, but like a feature of the practices. So to illustrate what I mean, I'm going to give you a couple examples of animist faith systems so you can get a sense for what they can look like. So the first of those are, like, the majority of Native American faiths are technically animist. And I'm just doing a big, big overview of these on your own. If you're interested, you can learn more. And I mean, even if you've just kind of watched some documentaries or, not to be totally reductionist, but watch Pocahontas, right, the Disney movie, and think about the song Colors of the Wind. That is referring to the animist qualities of their faith systems. The majority of Native American faiths are animist, and they believe that everything from, all of nature to their ancestors have spiritual power, and that the abundance of the world and that one's own like safety and success can depend on creating balance between these natural elements. A key feature amongst most Native American faiths is the concept of a shaman, or a priest or a priestess. And so here we can see like a shamanic dance. So a shaman is a religious leader, but not like someone standing at a pulpit and interpreting religious text. Instead, a shaman is someone who can create a bridge between the spirit world and the present world. Whether they do that through spirit possession and allow the spirits of natural elements to possess them, or maybe invite in ancestors who have passed. Shamans might also be able to do divining, such as using certain methods to foretell the future or to get advice from the spirit world. Some of their biggest roles are healers, and using herbology or spiritual tools to heal people of their illnesses. Another common feature in Native American faiths is the idea that rituals and customs of certain clans can be tied to specific animals because they believe that animals have very deep spiritual qualities. So for example, the Lenape people, who are the original inhabitants of this area, they had three major sacred animals: the gray wolf, the turkey, and the turtle. And they all have very specific qualities to them. And if we were to do a survey of other Native American faiths throughout this continent, we'd see that there are local animals that have particularly strong spiritual roles. Another example, I forgot. And so we can see this continued on today, right? We know that even though Native Americans have endured horrible things in history, including genocide, that they still persist, and that connection to nature is still very strong. There have been multiple Native American protests of the destruction of natural areas, whether we're talking about protesting pipelines that would destroy water sources or go through sacred lands. In Hawaii, there have been protests against certain groups, including astronomers who want to build on sacred mountains. So that's showing that connection, and that it's not just that they like nature, but they believe nature to be sacred. Another example that I want to talk about is a West African example, which is the Yoruba faith. So the Yoruba people are from West Africa, kind of in and around like Nigeria today. And it still persists as a faith. Some people practice the Yoruba faith alongside of Christianity or Islam, or they just only practice Yoruba faith. And so some of the features of the Yoruba faith that I want to highlight includes that they do technically believe in one main creator God, Olodumare. And when we study some stuff later in history, we'll see this come up again. And so, in that way, they do put a particular emphasis on one God over others, which isn't always the case in animist faiths. So, in terms of the idea of leading a good life, in the Yoruba faith, there's no real sense of like sin and that like some people go to heaven or hell. They generally believe in a concept of reincarnation or possibly being elevated to the level of something called an orisha. But the way that you live a good life is by performing your life to meet your specific fate. So that fate might be to be a really good mother. That fate might be to be a warrior, stuff like that. We'll see that this is similar to other faith systems. And so you just have to achieve that fate to lead a good life, and then hopefully you will be reincarnated in a way that rewards that. So the orishas are really powerful spiritual presences in the Yoruba faith. The orishas are spirits that connect humans in this present world to the divine, right? And as close to Olodumare as anyone can get. So some of the orishas were created or kind of came into existence at the same time as Olodumare, or he created them. Others are people who lived, or other beings that lived, who transcended to becoming orishas, right? So maybe it's an ancestor who lived a particularly divine life and they were elevated to the level of orisha. And so there's a lot of rituals to orishas to keep people safe, to grant prayers and intercessions and stuff like that. Some orishas take the form of natural resources. So again, we're seeing, similar to the Native American faith, a special emphasis on really respecting nature, because the belief that the spirit world can live in nature. And somewhat similar to the concept of Shakti is the concept of Asha. So Asha is a force that is possessed by humans, that lives in all humans, and really that lives in all beings. And the idea of Asha is that it's a powerful force that can cause change for good and bad, and that it essentially needs to be balanced. And the more that Asha within a human, and then also Asha amongst everything, is balanced, then the more harmonious life will be. But if it's in imbalance, that's where suffering comes from, that's where difficulty comes from, and that's where shamans and priests and priestesses come in to try to create that balance. So what we'll see as we continue is that the concept of Asha is similar to the concept of Qi in Chinese tradition, this idea that all humans have have an energy that needs to remain balanced for optimum health and happiness. Or in Indian tradition, the concept of chakra is really similar to that. And so here we can see some practitioners who are engaged in prayer and devotion, and they're engaged in a lot of kind of ceremonial dress. And masks are divine objects in the Yoruba faith that are used for spirit possession or for healing, or to demarcate really important like orisha and just other images. I love this. So there are these movies coming out in Nigeria in their movie industry called Nollywood. And this is a poster that came out of some of the gods that are coming out in these various movies, or orishas that are coming out in these various movies. And I love them because they are bringing them into the 21st century. They're making them look super powerful. And so you can kind of just take this in and enjoy this. But I love to see these kind of new takes on the orishas. And then the last faith that I want to preview, that's a really kind of classic animist faith, is the Shinto faith. So Shintoism is the native faith of Japan. It's been in Japan for really thousands of years. Shinto means the way of the gods. And just like in the other animist faiths I mentioned, There's a belief that essentially everything has a spirit. All natural elements have a spirit. And the term for spirit in the Shinto faith is the kami, Kami. And so, since everything has a spirit, everything needs to be honored. So, again, that's why the Japanese, just like the Native Americans, the Yoruba people, and other places where animist traditions continue, that's why there is such a deep relationship and respect for nature. One of the main symbols you see in Shintoism are torii gates. So that's like these images right here, super classic Japanese architecture. So torii gates are the entryways to shrines, and you see them all over the place in Japan. And the idea is that they are the gateway from the mundane to the sacred, but that needs to be demarcated because the sacred lives all around us. And it's a reminder that you may think you're living in the mundane or the world that does not have the spirits in them, but that's not true. There are places that are more sacred than others. We will talk about this a little bit more in context, but for example, Mount Fuji is considered a powerful kami, which is why it's illegal to do development on Mount Fuji and around there. So some are kind of more powerful than others, but everything is really sacred. And again, just to emphasize just how important nature is, it's why you see in Japan a lot of places that have a lot of restrictions regarding building and why there are so many Shinto shrines found amongst nature. So I thought like these were really pretty pictures. So here's a Shinto shrine and prayer cord that is built just amongst two very small islands. So that's really pretty. And then another Shinto shrine tucked away in the mountainside. And you often see like moss and tree branches just growing over the Shinto shrines. And people don't take them off because they just see that as a way to commune with nature. All right, so we'll go over some of this together and review it. Thank you for your attention.